this idea that Ukraine's president, Volodymyr Zelensky, should accept the Trump administration's plans that would require Ukraine to cede territory to Russia. That's not something that most of America's allies in Europe support.
Let's speak to national politics reporter for the Wall Street Journal, Sabrina Siddiqui. Sabrina, good evening.
Good to see you.
Well, that was a whopper of an interview with Politico, wasn't it? Not to sort of speak too highly of our rivals, but an incredible interview with Donald Trump, 45 minutes or so, with Politico's Dasha Burns, that's generated, well, a lot of news. The US president accused Ukraine's allies of talking too much and not delivering.
Well, there can be no question about it. It's Russia. It's a much bigger country. It's a war that should have never happened. Frankly, it wouldn't have happened if I were president, and it didn't happen for 4 years. I watched that taking place, and I said, wow, they're going to cause some problems here. And it started, and it could have evolved into World War III, frankly. I think it's probably not going to be happening now. I think if I weren't president, you could have had World War III. I think you would have had a much bigger problem than you have right now. But right now, it's a big problem. It's a big problem for Europe, and they're not handling it well.
Well, Trump also mentioned that Ukraine should hold elections despite the war.
Yeah, I think so. It's been a long time. It hasn't been doing particularly well. Yeah, I think it's time. I think it's an important time to hold an election. You know, they're using war not to hold an election, but I would think the Ukrainian people would, should have that choice, and maybe Zelensky would win. I don't know who would win, but they haven't had an election in a long time. They talk about a democracy, but it gets to a point where it's not a democracy anymore.
Well, Trump pushing an anti-Ukraine agenda there, Sabrina. I wonder if there's any commentary over there. First, the National Security Plan took out Russia as a threat. Here you have Donald Trump saying Russia has the upper hand. They always did. They're much bigger. They're much stronger in that sense. Zelensky is going to have to get on the ball and start accepting things. Bigging up Russia, praising Russia. Is there any concern over this approach by Donald Trump to Russia, who could, to be frank, it could come back to bite Donald Trump on the bottom, couldn't it?
Yeah, I think that it's really striking because, you and I have actually talked a few times on this program about how it had looked like President Trump's posture toward Russia in this term was tougher, quite tougher, in fact, than it was in his first term. But now you kind of see him once again taking a hard line against Ukraine. So he's just kind of gone back and forth throughout these negotiations for some kind of peace deal. And I think that there's a lot in this interview that will be very concerning to America's allies in Europe, not just the comments he made about European leaders, which we'll get to in a moment, but about this idea that Ukraine's president, Volodymyr Zelensky, should accept the Trump administration's plans that would require Ukraine to cede territory to Russia. That's not something that most of America's allies in Europe support. They support Zelensky's position that, ceding territorial control would be a non-starter. And, it's also unclear what security guarantees Trump is willing to provide to Ukraine. And so I think that there's certainly a sense that maybe because of his frustration that there has not been a deal, that he's willing to be more conciliatory toward Moscow as opposed to Kyiv.
Yeah, that indicates that he thinks Ukraine is weaker and will cave first, which offers Russia a level of respect that is raising eyebrows, certainly around Europe. We know that the US-backed or brokered peace deal is now being sent by Ukraine back to the United States. Has there been any word on it over there? As you say, it's the Ukrainians are expected to reject the notion that Russia can have the whole of the Donbass region. They don't occupy all of it at the moment. Are there any utterings, any whisperings over there about what might be coming back to Washington?
It's not entirely clear, frankly, what the revised peace plan from Ukraine might look like. I think the biggest sticking point, which we've just discussed, is this idea of Ukraine making territorial concessions to Russia. And if Zelensky is still ruling out surrendering control of territory, um, then it's not entirely clear, what the other path toward peace looks like. Are there going to be any other concessions on the part of Ukrainians? That's something that we don't yet know. But this is it's obviously something that Trump is very eager to get done, and President Trump is hoping for a deal by Christmas. It just doesn't look like that's something that's actually realistic, at least not at this current stage.
Yeah, maybe it is his frustration, but he has laid into Europe again in this interview, called European leaders weak, criticised the decaying group of nations for being too politically correct, failing to control immigration. He's walking a bit of a tightrope here. I mean, so far, certainly people messaging into our show this evening are criticising European nations for not standing up to Donald Trump, but they're in a tricky position and they need Donald Trump on side. They need trade deals. They need to be in the pocket of the leader of the free world. But equally, they are taking a reputational hammering from the president.
I mean, there's no question that he's been very critical of European leaders, and there's been very little pushback overall. Obviously, there are some who have rejected the idea that Europe is in need of saving. German Chancellor Merz did that, in fact. But like at the same time, I think, as you point out, because of the concern around the Trump administration's levying of tariffs, other punitive measures that they've been willing to wield against those who aren't willing to come to the table, the U.S. appears to, still have the rhetorical upper hand. I mean, this obviously, though, does could have the risk of damaging relationships between the U.S. and its allies. It further emboldens those who are saying that, what Europe actually needs to do is to gain more independence from Washington, to develop its own security policy and domestic policies that are less reliant on Washington. And then also there's just the question of what this means for Trump's potential interference in politics, because in this interview, he was essentially, offering thinly veiled support for far-right parties and movements in Europe. Could that actually be impactful when you see elections in Europe in the coming years? Perhaps it could.
Yeah, look, show some respect is what the EU chief has aimed at Donald Trump. This is the European Council President Antonio Costa. Said Europe and the US must act as allies, urged Donald Trump to show more respect. We respect the choice of Americans. They need to respect the democratic choices of our citizens. He said, he was speaking at a press conference in Ireland today. When all the leaders elect me president of the European Council, President Trump must respect this, as we respect that American citizens elected him president of the United States. It's like this, that allies behave with each other. In that national security document, the notion of the EU and other European bodies was also highly criticised by Donald Trump and his administration too. Let's talk about the deteriorating relationship, not just with Europe, but with Venezuela. Donald Trump was asked how far, in this interview with Politico, how far he would go to take President Maduro out of office.
I don't want to say that, but...
But you want to see him out?
His days are numbered.
Can you rule out an American ground invasion?
I don't want to rule in or out. I don't talk about it. Why would I talk to you, an extremely unfriendly publication, if you want to call it Politico, that got $8 million from Obama to keep it afloat? Why would I do that? Why would I talk about that to Politico? I mean, I'm doing this because you picked me as a man for Europe.
I'm asking for transparency for their American people, because a lot of folks are, well, people are wondering
I am
what
the
is...
most transparent politician maybe in the world.
Well, he did give them 45 minutes of his time, by the way. Surely not a US ground invasion into Venezuela, Sabrina.
I don't think there's any support for that, frankly. But the fact that he won't explicitly rule it out is not going to do much to alleviate the concerns among US lawmakers that these strikes against alleged drug boats and cartels is about more than just that. that perhaps there is a buildup that is aimed more so at regime change in Venezuela. But at the same time, Congress has not author. I mean, they have not authorized any kind of ground invasion. That's something that would require congressional approval. And there's really no appetite here with among the American public for another U.S. military entanglement. What's been quite bizarre in some ways about all of it is that it stands in direct contrast to everything we were just talking about, Trump trying to broker peace deals elsewhere, and to try and scale back U.S. military involvement, whether it's direct or indirect, in other parts of the world.
Okay. Let's stick with those U.S. strikes on Venezuelan boats. Congress is threatening to withhold money from Pete Hegseth's travel budget. He's the Secretary of State for War. Unless he provides the full unedited version of that double tap strike that we were reporting on last week. Trump said last week he had no problem releasing the video. Now says it's up to Pete Hegseth on what happens. Where does this one go? So Congress have the power basically to force Pete Hegseth via his travel budget to release the video of the strike.
Yeah, what's happening right now is that Congress is weighing its annual defense policy bill, which is where they appropriate the budget for a defense budget, and that's what they're trying to use as a tool to force the release of these unedited videos. It's one of the first, frankly, ways in which Republicans in Congress have shown a willingness to more directly challenge the administration. Democrats, of course, have tried all kinds of tactics, but because Republicans control both chambers of Congress, this is at least notable just in that it looks like there is bipartisan support for more transparency around these strikes in general, but especially the double tap strike that you just mentioned. Pete Hegseth, he wouldn't say over the weekend whether he'd released the video, but there is also disagreement over what's in that unedited footage. The top lawmakers, a select number of them who were briefed on the footage last week, had different interpretations of what the video revealed. So, in the interest of transparency, this certainly could help answer a lot of questions, and we'll see if it does become public, then it will, it could either vindicate the administration's narrative or challenge what they've been telling the public ever since this became a controversy.
Yeah, the double tap strike was the one that took place in the Caribbean on September the 2nd. There was a strike and then a second strike ordered, even though we know that there were survivors of the initial strike still on the boat. And that is the question: Did forces act legitimately when it came to that second strike on the alleged drug vessel? Okay, let's move on to President Trump's approval rating. It's gone back to around 41%. We're told because of his focus on affordability and bringing down the cost of living in the United States, making people feel richer, as a vote winner, apparently, Sabrina.
This is something that the administration has been struggling with, right? He had obviously been suffering from a declining approval rating, especially on the economy, which has long been actually seen as President Trump's strength, at least as far as polls are concerned. Whether, the numbers always match up is a separate conversation. But I think that you've seen this shift in the White House messaging, where they have focused a lot more on affordability ever since Democrats swept those handful of elections that were held in November, that were run entirely on affordability platforms. Democrats had focused entirely on costs of living and ways to improve costs for Americans through different ways. So I think you're getting a glimpse of what next year's midterm elections might look like. I think there's still a lot of warning signs for President Trump because there are still any number of polls showing that he's underwater. And including this one, his disapproval rating is still 57%. So a majority still disapprove. But, I think that this is perhaps showing how next year's midterm elections will be litigated, which is very much on the issue of the economy, inflation, and cost of living.
Sabrina, great to speak to you. Thank you so much. National politics reporter for the Wall Street Journal. A very thorough assessment of US politics even. Sabrina Siddiqui.